ったあった、ありましたありました。あと1分30秒。あと1分30秒。皆さんとはちょっとラグがあるとは思うけど、あと1分30秒です。あと1分20秒。ルタさん、スパチャありがとうございます。あとちょっとであとちょっとでいきますよ。1分前カウントでしょうか。ペロさん、スパチャありがとうございます。さあ来るぞ来るぞ来るぞ来るぞ。もう少しです、もう少し。いきますよ。60、59、58、57、56、55、54、53、52、51、50、49。
音聞こえるの助かる。
ちょっと待ってね、準備しないといけないわ。ごめんなさい。
よし。
ちょっと準備するね。
さあ、
変えないといけない。
1ゲーム、1ゲーオタの、
ベンジョソンさん、ありがとうございます。
1ゲーオタの僕の、あれも、意見を言っていこうか。
あと20秒。19、18、17、16、15、14、13、12、11、10、9、8、
頼みます。
6、5、4、3、
オーターメーガー。
始まります。1時になりました。なりました。さあどうだ。起動しよう。起動してくれ。どうだ。
来ないね。
もう少しで、あれ時間になったよ。もう始まるはず。ちょっとラグがあるんですよ、プレミア、この放送って。来たよ。おお、2分前カウントダウン来ました。
トリガー起動。
いやー、もうすぐ世紀の瞬間ですよ。
いやー、PS5 今どうなるかね。今の状況だと多分、まあ日本では多分そんな関係ないとは思うけど、Xbox の方が多分優勢かな。
クソデカ大気温助かる。
大気温でかい？これでかいかな。
ほう。
50秒。
大気温自体がでかい。
ああね、理解。ちょっと大きくしよ
配信は大丈夫だ。問題ない。
う。OK。あと30秒。もうなんでもう風呂入ってくんじゃなかったこれ。そう、まあだってすぐ出てきたばっかだからまだ髪乾かしてないんだけど、ちょっとでかいね。9。さあ
GTA 来ないかね。
来た。
Unfortunately, we had to cancel the talk that we had.
楽しみ。どういう状況ですか。
But we do have some super exciting news about PS5.
ごめん、今日はね、人が誰いるかとかわからないけど、PS5 の詳細を一芸オタの俺がいろいろ言っていこうっていう配信。
Lots of chances later on this year to look at the PlayStation 5 games. Today, I want to talk a bit about our goals for the PlayStation 5 hardware and how they influenced the development of the console. I think you all know I'm a big believer in console generations. Once every 5 or 6 or 7 years, a console arrives with substantially new capabilities. There's a lot of learning by the game developers, hopefully not too overwhelming, and soon there's games that could never have been created before. Now, it used to be that as a console designer, you'd somehow intuit what would be the best set of capabilities for the new console, and then build it in complete secrecy. For the PlayStation consoles, that period lasted through PlayStation 3, a powerful and groundbreaking console, but also one that caused quite a lot of heartache as it was initially difficult to develop games for.
金モザエが来
So,
た。
starting with PlayStation 4, we've taken a different approach, roughly centered around 3 principles. The first of these is listening to the developers, which is to say that a lot of what we put into a console derives directly from the needs and aspirations of the game creators. We definitely do have some ideas of our own, but at the core of our philosophy for designing consoles is that game players are here for the fantastic games, which is to say that game creators matter. Anything we can do to make life easier for the game creators or help them realize their dreams, we will do. So, about once every 2 years, I take a tour of the industry. I go to the various developers and publishers, sit down, and discuss how they're doing with the current consoles and what they'd like to see in future consoles. This requires weeks on the road, as reaching the bulk of the game creators involves talking to well over 100 people at something like 24 publishers and developers. And it is incredibly valuable. By the way, the feature most requested by the developers, that was an SSD, which we were very happy to put in the hardware, but a lot of problem solving was required. I'll be doing a deep dive on the SSD and surrounding systems later on in this talk. It's also key to make a generational leap while keeping the console sufficiently familiar to game developers. I think about this in terms of balancing evolution and revolution. Now, with PlayStation 1, 2, and 3, the target was a revolution each time with a brand new feature set. That was great in many ways, but time for the developers to get up and running got longer with each console. In the past, I've called this timed triangle. Here's what I had for those 3 consoles. To be clear, I'm not talking about time to make a game. Developers will be ambitious, and it may take them 6 years or so to realize their vision. What I'm talking about is that dead time before graphics and other aspects of game development are up and running, and trying to minimize that. On the other hand, if we're trying to reduce that dead time to 0, that means the hardware architecture can't change at all. We're handcuffed. We need to judge for each feature what value it adds, and whether it's worth the increase in developer time needed to support it. So with PlayStation 4, we were able to strike a pretty good balance between performance and familiarity. We got required learning back to PlayStation 1 levels. With PS5, the GPU was definitely the area we felt the most tension between adding new features and keeping a familiar programming model. Ultimately, I think we've ended up with something under a month of getting up to speed. That feels like we're striking about the right balance. I'll go into a bit more detail later today about
間違いなく新しい機能の追加と最終的に使い慣れたプログラミングモデルを維持することの間でもとの緊張を感じていた領域でした。適切なバランス GPU を使用した哲学と GPU に寄生する Oh my god
That's why the SSD was very much on our list of directions to explore,
これ配信できてる
regardless of what came out of the conversations with game developers and publishers. The biggest feature in this category is the custom engine for audio. That's today's final topic. The push for vastly improved audio, and in particular 3D audio, isn't something that came out of the developer meetings. It's much more the case that we had a dream of what might be possible 5 years from now, and then worked out a number of steps we could take to set us on that path. So here again are the 3 principles. The first being enabling the desires of developers to drive the hardware design. To me, the SSD really is the key to the next generation. It's a game changer. And it was the #1 ask from developers for PlayStation 5. As in, we know it's probably impossible, but can you put an SSD in? That was a discussion we were also having internally. It was clear that the presence of a hard drive in every PlayStation 4 was having a positive impact. A lot of things that would simply have been impossible at Blu-ray disc speeds were now possible. At the same time, though, in 2015 and 2016, when we were having these conversations, developers were already banging up against the limits of the hard drive, and a lot of developer time was being spent designing around slow load speeds. I want to focus in on just one number here, which is how long it takes to load a gigabyte of data from a hard drive. The difficulty being that hard drives are neither particularly fast nor flexible. If all your data
50
is in
メガバイト
one
リードス
block,
ピ
which
ー
is frankly not very likely, you can load 50 to
ド。
100 megabytes a second, depending on where the data is located on the hard drive. Let's assume it's on the average,
絵文字
which means
2
絵文
秒
字アンダーバー絵文字絵文字
If you compress your game packages, you can
2か
fit
ら
more
50
data
秒
on the Blu-ray disc and also
1ギガ
effectively
割
boost
る
your
100
hard
メガ
drive
バイ
read speed by
ト
the
割る
compression ratio. We support Z-Lib
6.7 秒
decompression on PlayStation 4 that gets you something like
210
50% more data
秒
on
か
the
かることを意
disc
味し
and
ます。ブルーレイディ
50%
スクを
higher
多くより
effective read
データを
speed.
進めることができ、ニュージーランド
Unfortunately, though, it's highly
の圧
likely
縮
that your
解
data
除
is
と
scattered
サポ
around
ー
in
ト
various
か
files on the
圧
hard
縮
drive,
率によって
as
ハード
well
ドライ
as
ブの読み
sourced
取りを
from
効果
multiple
的に高めることが
locations
できま
within
す。
those files. So lots of seeks
PS4
are
では
needed at
ディス
2
ク
to
上のデー
50-ish
タが
milliseconds
50%
each.
多くなり、有効速
My
度は
rule of thumb is
50%
that the hard drive
速
is
くなりま
spending
す。残念ながら
2/3
ポ
of
ジ
its
ティブな
time
ハードドライ
seeking
ブ
and only 1/3 of its time
うん
actually loading data.
まだ
Putting all
PS5 の
of that
回言っ
together,
てない
a
ね。
gigabyte is very roughly 20 seconds to load from a hard drive. Now, a gigabyte is not much data. Games are using 5 or 6
実際にロード
gigabytes
を
of
する時
RAM
間
on
だけの3
PlayStation
分の
4,
1
so
で
boot times and load times can get
ハード
pretty
ドライブから
quick.
ギガバイトに
Or
ハ
to
ー
put
ドドラ
that
イブロード
differently,
するに
as a
20
player,
秒
you wait for the game to boot, wait for the game to load, wait for the level to reload every time you die, and you wait for what is euphemistically called fast travel. And all of that leads to the dream. What if we could have not just an SSD,
PS5
but a blindingly fast
え
SSD? If we could load 5 gigabytes a second from it, what would change? Now, SSDs are completely different from hard drives. They don't have seeks as such. If you have a 5 gigabyte a second
マジで
SSD, you can read data from 1,000 different locations in that second, pretty much at speed. As for time to load a gigabyte, this is next gen we're talking about, so memory is bigger. Instead, we should be asking how long to load 2 gigabytes. And the answer is about a quarter
ロード
of
タイ
a
ム
second. I mean, that's
1ギ
amazing. We're
PS4 で
talking
1
2
ギガ
orders of
が
magnitude,
20秒かかったら
meaning
2ギ
very
ガで
roughly
0.27 秒になってる。
100 times faster.
相当
Which
速い
means
じゃん
that 5 gigabytes a second for the SSD, the potential is that the game boots in a second. There are no load screens. The game just fades down while loading a half dozen gigabytes and fades back up again. Same for a reload. You're immediately back in the action after you die. And fast travel becomes so fast it's blink and you miss it. As game creators, we go from trying to distract the player from how long fast travel is taking, like those Spider-Man subway rides, to being so blindingly fast that we might even have to slow that transition down. Pretty cool, right? But for me, this is
絵文
not
字
the
イコール
primary
絵文
reason to
字
change
絵
from a
文字
hard
アンダ
drive
ー
to
バ
an
ー絵文字
SSD.
絵文字
The
イコール
primary
絵文
reason
字
for an ultra-fast
こ
SSD
どう
is
し
that
た
it gives the game
草
designer freedom. Or to put that differently, with a hard drive, the 20 seconds that it takes to load a gigabyte can sabotage the game that the developer is trying to create. I think almost all of us in the room have experienced this, maybe in different ways. Say we're making an adventure game and we have
これ
two
配信で見
rich
るもんかな
environments where we each want enough textures and models to fill memory. Which you can do as long as you have a long staircase or elevator ride or a windy corridor where you can ditch the old assets and then take 30 seconds or so to load the new assets.
同時視聴
Having a
よ
30-second elevator ride is a little extreme. More realistically, we'd probably chop the world into a number of smaller pieces and then do some calculations with sight lines and run speeds like we did for Haven City when we were making Jack 2. The game is 20 years old, but not much has changed since then. All those twisted
同時で見て
passages
な
are
いけ
there
ど
for
も
a reason. There's a whole subset
まあ
of
それ
level
はね
design dedicated to this sort of work, but still, it's a giant distraction for a team that just wants to make their game. So when I talked about the dream of an SSD, part of the reason for that 5 gigabyte a second target was to eliminate loads, but also part of the reason for that target was streaming. As in, what if the SSD is so fast that as the player is turning around, it's possible to load textures for everything behind the player in that split second? If you figure that it takes half a second to turn, that's 4 gigabytes of compressed data you can load. That sounds about right for next gen. Anyway, back to the hard drive. Another strategy for increasing effective read speed is to make big sequential chunks of data. For example, we might group all the data together for each city block. That removes most of the seeks.
金モザ
and
嬉
the
しすぎ
streaming
て
is
湧き
faster.
そう
But there's a downside too, which is that frequently used data is included in many chunks and therefore is on the hard drive many, many times. Marvel's Spider-Man uses this strategy, and though it works very well for increasing the streaming speed, there's a massive duplication as a result. Some of the objects like mailboxes or news racks are on the hard drive 400 times. What I'm describing here are things that cramp a creative director's style. Either level design gets a little bit boring in places, or the data is duplicated so many times that it no longer fits on the Blu-ray disc. And you end up with hard limits on the player's run speed or driving speed. The player can't go faster than the load speed from the hard drive. And finally, I'm sure many of you have noticed that after a patch download, the PlayStation 4 will sometimes take a long time to install the patch. That's because when just part of a file has been changed, the new data can be downloaded pretty quickly. But before the game boots up, a brand new file has to be constructed that includes the changed portion. Otherwise, every change would add a seek or two. Even so, you can occasionally see this happening on game titles. They start to hitch once they get patched enough. With an SSD, though, no seeks, so no need to make brand new files with the changes incorporated into them, which means no installs as you know them today. There's yet one more benefit, which is that system memory can be used much more efficiently. On PlayStation 4, game data on the hard drive feels very distant and difficult to use. By the time you realize you need a piece of data, it's much too late to go out and load it. So system memory has to contain all of the data that could be used in the next 30 seconds or so of gameplay. That means a lot of the 8 gigabytes of system memory is idle. It's just waiting there to be potentially used. On PlayStation 5, though, the SSD is very close to being like more RAM. Typically, it's fast enough that when you realize you need a piece of data, you can just load it from the SSD and use it. There's no need to have lots of data parked in system memory waiting to potentially be used. A different way of saying that is that most of RAM is working on the game's behalf. This is one of the reasons that 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 feels right for PlayStation 5. The presence of the SSD reduces the need for a massive intergenerational increase in size. So, back to the dream of the SSD. Here's the set of targets. Boot the game in a second. No load screens. Design freedom, meaning no twisty passages or long corridors. More game on the disk and more game on the SSD. And finally, those patch installs go away. The reality, though, is that the SSD is just one piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of places where bottlenecks can occur in between the SSD and the game code that uses the data. You can see this on PlayStation 4. If I use an SSD with 10 times the speed of a standard hard drive, I probably see only double the loading speed, if that. For PlayStation 5, our goal was not just that the SSD itself be 100 times faster. It was that game loads and streaming would be 100 times faster. So every single potential bottleneck needed to be addressed.
とりあえず PS5 の SSD を PS4 よりリード時間が100倍速くなるよっていう相当革命だぞこれは。
It's examined, a few values are tweaked to check it in, and then it's moved to its final location. At the SSD speeds we're talking about, that last part, moving the data, meaning copying it from one location to another, takes roughly an entire next-gen CPU core. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. If all the overheads get 100 times larger, that will cripple the frame rate as soon as the player moves, and that massive stream of data starts coming off the SSD. So to solve all of that, we built a lot of custom hardware, namely a custom flash controller and a number of custom units in our main chip. The flash controller in the SSD was designed for smooth and bottleneck-free operation, but also with game data. For example, there are 6 levels of priority when reading from the SSD. Priority is very important. You can imagine the player heading into some new location in the world and the game requesting a few gigabytes of textures. And
止まった。止まっちゃったい。
While those textures are being loaded, an enemy is shot and has to speak a few dying words. Having multiple priority levels lets the audio for those dying words get loaded immediately. On one side, that flash controller connects to the actual flash dies that supply the storage. To reach our bandwidth target of 5 gigabytes a second, we ended up with a 12-channel interface. 8 channels wouldn't be enough. the resulting bandwidth we've achieved is actually 5.5 gigabytes a second. With a 12-channel interface, the most natural size that emerges for an SSD is 825 gigabytes. The key question for us was, is that enough? I mean, it's tempting to add more, but Flash certainly doesn't come cheap, and we have a responsibility to our gaming audience to be cost-effective with regards to what we put in the console. Ultimately, we resolved this question by looking at the play patterns of a broad range of gamers. We examined the specific games that they were playing over the course of a weekend or a week or a month, and whether that set of games would fit properly on the SSD. We were able to establish that the friction caused by reinstalls or redownloads would be quite low, and so we locked in on that 825 gigabyte size, while also preparing multiple strategies so that those who want more storage can add it. I'll go through the details in a moment. Back to the Flash controller. On the other side, it connects to our main custom chip via 4 lanes of Gen 4 PCIe. And inside the main custom chip is a pretty hefty unit dedicated to I/O. Before we talk about what that does, let's talk compression for a moment. PlayStation 4 used zlib as its compression format. We decided to use it again on PlayStation 5, but on my 2017 tour of developers, I learned about a new format called Kraken from Rad Game Tools. It's like zlib's smarter cousin. Simple, similar types of algorithms, but about 10% better compression, which is pretty big. That means 10% more game on the UHD Blu-ray disc or on the SSD. Kraken had only been out for a year, but it was already becoming a de facto industry standard. Half of the teams I talked to were either using it or getting ready to evaluate it. So we hustled and built a custom decompressor into the I/O unit, one capable of handling over 5 gigabytes of Kraken format input data a second. After decompression, that typically becomes 8 or 9 gigabytes, but the unit itself is capable of outputting as much as 22 gigabytes a second if the data happen to compress particularly well. By the way, in terms of performance, that custom decompressor equates to 9 of our Zen 2 cores. That's what it would take to decompress the Kraken stream with a conventional CPU. There's a lot more in the custom I/O unit, including a dedicated DMA controller. The game can direct exactly where it wants to send the data coming off of the SSD. This equates to another Zen 2 core in terms of its copy performance. Its primary purpose is to remove check-in.
この人を D ゲイルって言うんだけど D ゲイルさんがGoogle 翻訳で今翻訳して配信流しながら翻訳を
One of the coprocessors is dedicated to SSD I/O. This lets us bypass traditional file I/O and its bottlenecks when reading from the
全然わかんないけど画面の方見て
The other is responsible for memory mapping, which I know doesn't sound like anything related to the SSD, but a lot of developers map and remap memory as part of file I/O, and this too can become a bottleneck. There are coherency engines to assist the coprocessors. Coherency comes up a lot in places. Probably the biggest coherency issue is stale data in caches. Flushing all of the GPU caches whenever the SSD is read is an unattractive option. It could really hurt the GPU performance. So we've implemented a gentler way of doing things, where the coherency engines inform the GPU of the overwritten address ranges and custom scrubbers in several dozen GPU caches to pinpoint evictions of just those address ranges. The best thing is, as a game developer, when you read from the SSD, you don't need to know any of this. You don't even need to know that your data is compressed. You just indicate what data you'd like to read from your original uncompressed file and where you'd like to put it, and the whole process of loading it happens invisibly to you and at very high speed. Back to the dream. Thanks to all of that surrounding hardware, our 5.5 gigabytes a second really should translate into something like 100 times faster I/O than PS4 and allow the dream of no load screens and super fast streaming to become a reality. Having said that, expandability of our SSD is going to be quite important. Flash is costly, and you may very well want to add storage to whatever we put in the console. Now, the kind of storage depends on how you're going to use it. If you have an extensive PlayStation 4 library and you'd like to take advantage of backwards compatibility to play those games on PlayStation 5, then a large external hard drive is ideal. You can leave your games on the hard drive and play them directly,
流れるってこ
thus
とや
saving
な
the pricier SSD storage for your PlayStation 5 titles. Or you can copy your active PlayStation 4 titles to the
PS4 ライブラリ
SSD.
が介護
If your
管
purpose in adding more storage is to play
介護管制を利用
PlayStation
し
5
て
titles,
PS5 のトレーラーでこれらのゲームをプレイしたい場合は大きな外付けハードディスクが理想です。ってことは PS4 のライブラリーがあって
それやばね。
PS4 のライブラリーがあって PS5 でゲームをプレイしたい場合は外付けハードディスクを用意しろってことか。違うか。ハードドライブにゲームを残し保存から直接プレイできます。
Here's the catch, though. That commercial drive has to be at least as fast as ours. Games that rely on the speed of our SSD need to work flawlessly with any M2 drive. When I gave the Wired interview last year, I said that the PlayStation 5 SSD was faster than anything available on PC. At the time, commercial
取り
M2
付けることの
drives
でき
used
るライブラリー
PCIe
が少なさを
3.0,
サポートす
and
るかに
4
ついて
lanes
は
of
分か
that
らない。
cap out at 3.5
すみま
gigabytes
せ
a
ん。
second. In other
よ
words,
くわかりませ
no
ん。
PCIe 3.0 drive can hit the
うーん。
M2 drives with PCIe
もしかして PS4 のタイトル PS5 で遊べるぞ。
in samples and seeing 4 or 5 gigabytes a second from them. By year's end, I expect there will be drives that saturate 4.0 and support 7 gigabytes a second. Having said that, we are comparing apples and oranges, though, because that commercial M2 drive will have its own architecture, its own flash controller, and so on. For example, the NVMe specification lays out a priority scheme for requests that the M2 drives can use. And that scheme is pretty nice, but it only has 2 true priority levels. Our drives support 6. We can hook up a drive with only 2 priority levels, definitely, but our custom I/O unit has to arbitrate the extra priorities rather than the M2 drive's flash controller. And so the M2 drive needs a little extra speed to take care of issues arising from the different approach. That commercial drive also needs to physically fit inside of the bay we created in PlayStation 5 for M2 drives. Unlike internal hard drives, there's unfortunately no standard for the height of an M2 drive, and some M2 drives have giant heat sinks. In fact, some of them even have their own fans. Right now, we're getting M2 drive samples and benchmarking them in various ways. When games hit beta as they get ready for the PlayStation 5 launch at year-end, we'll also be doing some compatibility testing to make sure that the architecture of particular M2 drives isn't too foreign for the
ベンチマ
games
ーク
to
を行ってい
handle.
ます。5年
Once we've done that compatibility
が
testing,
年
we
に
should be
発
able to
売され
start
特
letting
定
you
の
know
M2 ドライ
which
ブのア
drives
ー
will
キテクチャ
physically fit and which
が
drive
外
samples
国語
have
にならない
benchmarked
ことを確認して
appropriately
互換テ
high
ストを
in
完
our
了したら
testing.
ゲームを終了す
It
るこ
would
と
be
ができるよう
great
に
if
しま
that
す。
happened by
どの
launch,
ドラ
but
イブ
it's
が
likely to be a
物理的
bit
に適合
past
する
it.
か
So
ベンチマークに
please
関する
hold
特
off
定の
on getting that M2
IMR
drive
テストを
until
す
you
る
hear from us.
であるか知っておい
Okay,
てください。
back to our principles.
よくわからん
Balancing
の。
evolution and revolution is the second of them. This was definitely a recurring theme with the GPU. We need new GPU features and capabilities. If we only have more performance, it's not really a new
要するにもしかしたら PS4 のゲームが PS5 でできるかもしれないわな。
result in more performance. That's part of why a PlayStation 5 teraflop is more powerful than a PlayStation 4 teraflop. But we aren't just looking for the performance. We also need the ability to do something with the GPU that could
テラ
not
フロッ
have
プより
been
も
done
強力な
before.
結果になりますが、
And we need higher performance per watt. Every time we double the performance of some GPU component, we don't want to find out we've doubled the
コン
power
ポーネン
consumed
トパフォーマン
and
スを
the
2 倍にすること、す
But
る
at
た
the
びに
same
2倍になった
time,
ことを
we
知
have
り
to
たくない
make
ためにより
sure
高
the
いパフォーマン
GPU
スを
can
必要
run
に
PS
ま
more
でできなくなった
games.
GPU を
And
毎
we
日
have
使
to
用され
ensure
る
that
に
the
よって
architecture is
進み
easy
され
for
た
the
ので、
developers to adopt.
同時に PS4 ゲームを
Backwards
実
compatibility
行で
was
きる
handled
かどう
masterfully
かを
by
確
AMD.
認する必
They
要があります。
treated it as a key
また開発者
need
がバンドル
throughout
回
the
すと
design
の
process. As our
介護
solution
感
to adding new features without blindsiding developers, we made sure that
お
if there were new significant features, it would be optional to use them. The GPU supports ray tracing, but you don't have to use ray tracing to make your game. The GPU supports primitive shaders, but you can release your first game on PlayStation 5 without making any use of them. Before I get into the capabilities of the GPU, I'd like to make clear 2 points that can be quite confusing. First, we have a custom AMD GPU based on their RDNA 2 technology.
その
What does that
AMD
mean?
GPU を持っています。
AMD is continuously
それが
improving
何を意
and
味する
revising
か。
their tech for RDNA2, their goals were, roughly speaking,
これは AMG が継続的に改造されている。おお、なんかすごい見づらいな。
to optimize the GPU for performance and to add a new, more advanced feature set.
パフォーマンスのために GPU を再起化し、高い高度な機能を追加する必要がありますが、その機能は順応性があり、つまり独自のニーズにあるということ。
Collaboration is born. If we bring concepts to AMD that are felt to be widely useful, then they can be adopted into RDNA2 and used broadly, including in PC GPUs. If the ideas are sufficiently specific to what we're trying to accomplish, like the GPU cache scrubbers I was talking about, then they end up being just for us. If you see a similar discrete GPU available as a PC card at roughly the same time as we release our console, that means our collaboration with AMD succeeded in producing technology useful in both worlds. It doesn't mean that we as Sony simply incorporated the PC part into our console. This continuous improvement in AMD technology means it's dangerous to rely on teraflops as an absolute indicator of performance. And CPU count should be avoided as well. In the case of CPUs, we all understand that the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 each have 8 CPUs, but we never think that meant the capabilities and performance are equal. It's the same for CUs. For one thing, they've been getting much larger over time. Adding new features means adding lots of transistors. In fact, the transistor count for a PlayStation 5 CU is 62% larger than the transistor count for a PlayStation 4 CU. Second, the PlayStation 5 GPU is backwards compatible with PlayStation 4. What does that mean? One way you can achieve backwards compatibility is to put the previous console's chipset in the new console, like we did with some PlayStation 3.
以前のコンソールを廃止すること、PS3 で行ったようにコンソールに配置することですが、別に一緒に効果で優れた方法です。
Meaning that even as the technology evolves, the logic and feature set that PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 4 Pro titles rely on is still available in backwards compatibility modes. One advantage of this strategy is that
待って PS5 でもしかして PS4 できる？
It's not as if a cost down will remove backwards compatibility like it did on PlayStation 3. Achieving this unification of functionality took years of efforts by AMD, as any roadmap advancement creates a potential divergence in logic. Running PS4 and PS4 titles at boosted frequencies has also added complexity. The boost is truly massive this time around, and some game code just can't handle it. Testing has to be done on a title-by-title basis. Results are excellent, though. We recently took a look at the top 100 PlayStation 4 titles as ranked by playtime, and we're expecting almost all of them to be playable at launch on PlayStation 5. With regards to new features, as I said, our strategy was to try to break new ground, but at the same time
プレイ時間でランク付けされた上位100のプレイステーション4タイトルを確認しました。発売時に大幅プレイになる可能になると予想しています。
Software handles vertex processing, but for the most part, dedicated hardware is responsible for the triangles and other geometry that the vertices form.
ほとんどの場合
That
専用
means
です。
it's not possible to do even basic optimizations, such as aborting processing of a vertex if all geometry that uses it is off-screen.
リアルに PS5 化け物だぞ。
A new unit called the Geometry Engine, which brings handling of triangles and other primitives under full programmatic control. As a game developer, you're free to ignore its existence and use the PlayStation 5 GPU as if it were no more capable than the PS4 GPU, or you can use this new intelligence in various ways. Simple usage could be performance optimization, such as removing backfaced or off-screen vertices and triangles. More complex usage involves something called primitive shaders, which allow the game to synthesize geometry on the fly as it's being rendered. It's a brand new capability. Using primitive shaders on PlayStation 5 will allow for a broad variety of techniques, including smoothly varying level of detail, addition of procedural detail to close-up objects, and improvements to particle effects and other visual special effects. Another major new feature of our custom RDNA2-based GPU is ray tracing, using the same strategy as AMD's upcoming PC GPUs. The CUs contain a new specialized unit called the intersection engine, which can calculate the intersection of rays with boxes and triangles. To use the intersection engine, first you build what is called an acceleration structure. It's data in RAM that contains all of your geometry. There's a specific set of formats you can use. They're variations on the same BVH concept. Then, in your shader program, you use a new instruction that asks the intersection engine to check array against the BVH. While the intersection engine is processing the requested ray triangle or ray box intersections, the shaders are free to do other work. Having said that, the ray tracing instruction is pretty memory intensive, so it's a good mix with logic-heavy code. There's of course no need to use ray tracing. PS4 graphics engines will run just fine on PlayStation 5. But it presents an opportunity for those interested. I'm thinking it'll take less than 1 million rays a second to have a big impact on audio. That should be enough for audio occlusion and some reverb calculations. With a bit more of the GPU invested in ray tracing, it should be possible to do some very nice global illumination. Having said that, adding ray-traced shadows and reflections to a traditional graphics engine could easily take hundreds of millions of rays a second, and full ray tracing could take billions. How far can we go? I'm starting to get quite bullish. I've already seen a PlayStation 5 title that's successfully using ray tracing-based reflections in complex animated scenes with only modest costs. Another set of issues for the GPU involved size and frequency. How big do we make the GPU, and what frequency do we run it at? This is a balancing act. The chip has a cost, and there's a cost for whatever we use to supply that chip with power and to cool it. In general, I like running the GPU at higher frequency. Let me show you why. Here's 2 possible configurations for a GPU roughly of the level of the PlayStation 4 Pro. This is a thought experiment. Don't take these configurations too seriously. If you just calculate teraflops, you get the same number. But actually, the performance is noticeably different because teraflops is defined as the computational capability of the vector ALU. That's just one part of the GPU. There are a lot of other units. And those other units all run faster when the GPU frequency is higher. At 33% higher frequency, rasterization goes 33% faster. Processing the command buffer goes that much faster. The L2 and other caches have that much higher bandwidth, and so on. About the only downside is that system memory is 33% further away in terms of cycles. But the large number of benefits more than counterbalance that. As a friend of mine says, a rising tide lifts all boats. Also, it's easier to fully use 36 CUs in parallel than it is to fully use 48 CUs. When triangles are small, it's much harder to fill all those CUs with useful work. So there's a lot to be said for faster, assuming you can handle the resulting power and heat issues, which frankly, we haven't always done the best job at. Part of the reason for that is, historically, our process for setting CPU and GPU frequencies has relied on some heavy-duty guesswork with regards to how much electrical power games will consume and how much heat will be produced as a result inside of the console. Power consumption varies a lot from game to game. When I play God of War on my PS4 Pro, I know the power consumption is high just by the fan noise. But power isn't simply about engine quality. It's about the minutiae of what's being displayed and how. It's counterintuitive, but processing dense geometry typically consumes less power than processing simple geometry, which is, I suspect, why Horizon's map screen, with its low triangle count, makes my PS4 Pro heat up so much. Our process on previous consoles has been to try to guess what the maximum power consumption during the entire console lifetime might be, which is to say, the worst case scene in the worst case game, and prepare a cooling solution that we think will be quiet at that power level. If we get it right, fan noise is minimal. If we get it wrong, the console will be quite loud for the higher power games, and there's even a chance that it might overheat and shut down if we misestimate power too badly. PlayStation 5 is especially challenging because the CPU supports 256-bit native instructions that consume a lot of power. These are great here and there, but presumably only minimally used. Or are they? If we plan for major 256-bit instruction usage, we need to set the CPU clock substantially lower or noticeably increase the size of the power supply and fan. So, after much discussion, we decided to go with a very different direction for PlayStation 5. we built a GPU with 36 CUs. Mind you, RDNA2 CUs are large. Each has 62% more transistors than the CUs we were using on PlayStation 4. So if we compare transistor counts, 36 RDNA2 CUs equates to roughly 58 PlayStation 4 CUs. It is a fairly sizable GPU. Then we went with a variable frequency strategy for PlayStation 5, which is to say we continuously run the GPU and CPU in boost mode. We supply a generous amount of electrical power and then increase the frequency of GPU and CPU until they reach the capabilities of the system's cooling solution. It's a completely different paradigm. Rather than running at constant frequency and letting power vary based on the workload, we run at essentially constant power and let the frequency vary based on the workload. We then tackled the engineering challenge of a cost-effective and high-performance cooling solution designed for that specific power level. In some ways, it becomes a simpler problem because there are no more unknowns. There's no need to guess what power consumption the worst-case game might have. As for the details of the cooling solution, we're saving them for our teardown. I think you'll be quite happy with what the engineering team came up with. So, how fast can we run the GPU and CPU with this strategy? The simplest approach would be to look at the actual temperature of the silicon die and throttle the frequency on that basis. But that won't work. It fails to create a consistent PlayStation 5 experience. It wouldn't do to run a console slower simply because it was in a hot room. So rather than look at the actual temperature of the silicon die, we look at the activities that the GPU and CPU are performing and set the frequencies on that basis, which makes everything deterministic and repeatable. While we're at it, we also use AMD's Smart Shift technology and send any unused power from the CPU to the GPU so it can squeeze out a few more pixels. The benefits of this strategy are quite large. Running a GPU at 2 gigahertz was looking like an unreachable target with the old fixed frequency strategy. With this new paradigm, we're able to run way over that. In fact, we have to cap the GPU frequency at 2.23 gigahertz so that we can guarantee that the on-chip logic operates properly. 36 CUs at 2.23 gigahertz is 10.3 teraflops, and we expect the GPU to spend most of its time at or close to that frequency.
2.23 GHz
Similarly, running the CPU at 3 gigahertz was causing headaches with the old strategy. But now we can run it as high as 3.5 gigahertz. In fact, it spends most of its time at that frequency. That doesn't mean all games will be running at 2.23 gigahertz and 3.5 gigahertz. When that worst-case game arrives, it will run at a lower clock speed, but not too much lower. To reduce power by 10%, it only takes a couple of percent reduction in frequency, so I'd expect any downclock to be pretty minor. All things considered, the change to a variable frequency approach will show significant gains for PlayStation games. The final of our 3 principles was about finding new dreams. It's important for us on the hardware team to find new ways to expand or deepen gaming, and that's what led us to a focus on 3D audio. As players, we experience the game through the visuals, through audio, and through the feedback we receive from the controller, such as rumble or haptics. Personally, I feel a game is just dead without audio. Visuals are, of course, important, but the impact of audio is huge as well. At the same time, the audio team on a game project has to do a lot with a little. For example, on PlayStation 4, there's fierce competition for the Jaguar CPU cores. Audio typically ends up getting just a fraction of a core.
違うわ、12とかって化け物だったんだよね、確か。
particularly when you consider that the visuals run at 30 or 60 frames a second, but audio processing needs to happen at almost 200 times a second. So, it's been tough going making forward progress on audio with PlayStation 4, particularly when PlayStation 3 was such a beast when it came to audio. The SPUs in Cell were almost a perfect device for audio rendering. Simple pipelined algorithms could really take advantage of asynchronous DMA and frequently reached 100% utilization of the floating point unit. There's unfortunately nothing comparable on PlayStation 4. Probably the most dramatic progress in the PlayStation 4 generation has been with virtual reality. The PSVR hardware has its own audio unit. It supports about 50 pretty decent 3D sound sources, and this provided a hint as to where we could go with audio, as well as some valuable experience. Not to oversimplify, but here were our goals for audio on PlayStation 5. The first goal was great audio for everyone, not just VR users or soundbar owners or headphone users. That meant audio had to be part of the console. It couldn't be a peripheral. The second goal was to support hundreds of sound sources. We didn't want developers to have to pick and choose what sounds would get 3D effects and which wouldn't. We wanted every sound in the game to have dimensionality. And finally, we wanted to really take on the challenges of presence and locality. Now, when we say presence, we mean the feeling that you're actually there. You've entered the matrix. It's not, of course, something we thought we could perfectly achieve. The idea was that if we stopped using just a rain sound, and instead used lots of 3D audio sources for raindrops hitting the ground at all sorts of locations around you, then at some point your brain would take a leap and you'd begin to have this feeling of real presence inside the virtual world of the game. This has the capacity to affect your appreciation of the game, just like music in a game does. The concept of locality is simpler. It's just your sense of where the audio is coming from, to the right of you, behind you, above you. This can immerse you further in the game, and it can also directly enhance the gameplay. To use Dead Space as an example, I know, old school, you're fighting enemies in fairly dark, spooky locations. Back in the day, if you played the game using the TV speakers, you could tell that there was one last enemy growling and hunting you down, but it was difficult to tell quite where that enemy was. With headphones, you could tell that the enemy was somewhere on the right, which let you deduce, if you couldn't see it, that it must be somewhere behind and to your right. But with 3D audio with good locality, the idea is you know the enemy is precisely there, and you turn, and you take it out. So, how do we know where a sound is coming from in the first place? Well, all those bumps and folds in the ear have a meaning, evolutionarily speaking. Based on what direction the sound is coming from, sound waves bounce around inside the ear, there's some constructive and destructive interference, and the result is a change in volume. The phase of the sound also shifts, depending on what path the sound wave took to reach the ear canal. These volume changes and phase shifts are different for each direction and also vary depending on the frequency of the sound. Head size and head shape also impact the sound in a similar fashion. The way that the sound changes, based on direction and frequency, can be encoded in a table called the Head-Related Transfer Function, or HRTF. Here's part of one. The vertical axis is the frequency. The horizontal axis is the direction, front, back, left, right, and the color gives the degree of attenuation of the sound at that frequency. The HRTF is as unique to an individual as a fingerprint is. In fact, you're looking at mine right now. Here's how we measure an HRTF. We've taken hundreds of people through this process. We put a microphone in the subject's left and right ear canals, and then sit the subject down in the middle of an array of 22 speakers. We then play an audio sweep from each speaker as we rotate the subject. In the course of 10 or 20 minutes, we're able to sample the HRTF at over 1,000 locations. Using an HRTF when rendering audio creates unparalleled quality, but it's computationally expensive. The simplest way to use an HRTF is to process a sound source to make it appear as if it's coming from one of those 1,000 locations we sample. Unfortunately, the processing has to be done in frequency domain rather than time domain, so there's multiple fast Fourier transforms needed for every sound source for every audio tick. That's a lot of multiplies. This computational complexity was the determining factor for our strategy. It meant we had to bite the bullet and design and build a custom hardware unit for 3D audio. Collectively, we're referring to the hardware unit and the proprietary algorithms we run on it as Tempest 3D Audio Tech. The meaning of 3D audio and technology should be pretty obvious here. As for Tempest, I feel it really reflects our goals with audio. It suggests a certain intensity of experience and also hints at your presence within it. We're calling the hardware unit that we built the Tempest engine. It's based on AMD's GPU technology. We modified a compute unit in such a way as to make it very close to the SPUs in PlayStation 3. Remember when I said that they were ideal for audio? So the Tempest engine has no caches, just like an SPU. All data access is via DMA, just like an SPU. Our target was that it would have more power than a CPU, thanks to the parallelism that a GPU can achieve, and that it would be more efficient than our GPU, thanks to the SPU-like architecture. The goal being to make possible near 100% utilization of the CU's vector units. Where we ended up is a unit with roughly the same SIMD power and bandwidth as all 8 Jaguar cores in the PlayStation 4 combined. If we were to use the same algorithms as PSVR, that's enough for something like 5,000 sound sources. But of course, we want to use more complex algorithms, and we don't need anything like that number of sounds.
これ英語で何言ってるか分かん
It
ない
would
ね。
have been wonderful if a simpler strategy, such as using Dolby Atmos peripherals, could have achieved our goals, but we wanted 3D audio for all, not just those with licensed soundbars or the like. Also, we wanted many hundreds of sound sources, not just the 32 that Atmos supports. And finally, we wanted to be able to throw an overwhelming amount of processing power at the problem, and it wasn't clear what any peripheral might have inside of it. In fact, with the Tempest engine, we've even got enough power that we can allocate some to the games, to the extent that games want to make use of convolution reverb and other algorithms that are either computationally expensive or need high bandwidth. But the primary purpose of the Tempest engine remains 3D audio. Now, 3D audio is a major academic research topic. It's safe to say that no one in the world has all of the answers. And the set of algorithms that has to be invented, tuned, or implemented to realize our vision for 3D audio is immense. For example, use of HRTFs in games is quite complex. Before, I talked about making a sound source appear as if it's coming from one of those 1,000 HRTF sample locations. But for high-quality 3D game audio, we have to handle other possibilities. The sound source might not be at one of the 1,000 HRTF sample locations, so we have to blend the HRTF data from the closest locations that we have sampled. The sound source might be moving, which needs very special handling as that blend keeps changing, and that can cause phase artifacts in the resulting audio. Or the sound source might have a size to it, meaning it should feel as if it's coming from an area rather than a single point. There's also whole categories of approaches to be handled. 3D audio can be implemented using individual processing of 3D sound sources. But alternatively, ambisonics can be used for 3D audio. Ambisonics being somewhat like the spherical harmonics used in computer graphics.
さっきから
And
3D
finally,
オーディオ
there's
しか
audio
聞き取れないんだ
devices.
けど。
The player might be using headphones or TV speakers or have a higher-end surround sound setup with
ちょっと待っちゃったね。ここまでの、もしかしたら、周辺機器までなんかサポートしそうだな。
all of which need different approaches. That's a lot of variations. It's nice to have the computational resources of the Tempest engine, but it's clear that achieving our ultimate goals with 3D audio is going to be a multi-year, step-by-step process. Having said that, headphone audio implementation is largely complete at this time. It was a natural place for us to start. With headphones, we control exactly what each ear hears, and therefore the algorithmic development and implementation are more straightforward. For TV speakers and stereo speakers, we're in the
ヘッド
process
ホ
of
ンオーディオ
implementing
の
virtual
実装は
surround
現時点
sound.
で
The idea
ほ
being
ぼ
that if
完
you're
成
sitting in a
してい
sweet
る
spot
と
in
ステ
front
ッ
of
プ
the
プロセ
TV,
ス
then the sound can
に
be
よっ
made
て
to
どれ
feel
に言い
as
ま
if
す
it's
か
coming
ヘッ
from
ドホ
any
ンセッ
direction,
トで始め
even
る場合
behind you.
のが自然な場所だ
Virtual
ったので
surround sound
仮
has
想
a
サウン
lot
ド
in
サテラ
common with 3D audio on headphones,
サテラ
but
イトサウ
it's
ンド
more complex because the left ear can hear the right speaker and vice versa. We have a basic implementation of virtual surround sound up and running. We're now looking at increasing the size of that sweet spot, which is to say, making the area you need to be in to feel the 3D effect larger, and we're also working to boost the sense of locality. Headphone audio is the current gold standard for 3D audio on PlayStation 5, but we're going to see what we can do to bring virtual surround sound to a similar level, after which we'll start in on setups with more speakers, such as 6-channel surround sound. It's now to the point where some of the PlayStation 5 games in development are extensively using these systems. One of the game demos allows you to toggle between conventional PlayStation 4-style stereo audio and our new 3D audio. I listened with just an ordinary pair of over-the-ear headphones, and wow, I could feel a difference. 3D audio has that dimensional feel to it. Conventional stereo audio feels smashed flat by comparison. the improvement is obvious. So, a big advancement, but have I entered the matrix? Does my brain believe I'm really there, like I was talking about earlier when I explained our target of presence? Well, the answer is no, but you've probably caught on to what's missing here, namely whose HRTF was being used. It wasn't mine, it was the default HRTF. The audio team analyzed the hundreds that they measured and chose the one they felt was the closest fit to the total gameplay audience. This shows a piece of the default HRTF on the left and my HRTF on the right. You can see that the general features are much the same, but the details are quite different. With the default HRTF, as I said, the 3D audio sounds pretty great. When I use my HRTF, though, the audio reaches a higher level of realism, which is to say that when using headphones and my HRTF, I occasionally get fooled and even think a sound is coming from the real world when it's actually coming from the game. A corollary to this is that there are a few people whose HRTFs are sufficiently far from the default HRTF, that's the red dot here, that they can toggle between PS4 style and PS5 style audio and not sense much difference. I've had a few people describe the PlayStation 5's 3D audio as sounding like a bit better stereo audio. Presumably they're the ones at the very edges of this diagram. Which means what HRTF you're using is key. I'd like everyone to be able to experience what I'm experiencing, but obviously it's not possible to measure the HRTF of every PlayStation user. That means HRTF selection and synthesis are going to be big topics going forward as the Tempest technology matures. At PlayStation 5 launch, we'll be offering a choice of 5 HRTFs. There's a simple test where you pick the one that gives you the best locality. That's just the first step, though. This is an open-ended research topic. Maybe you'll be sending us a photo of your ear, and we'll choose a neural network to pick the closest HRTF in our library. Maybe you'll be sending us a video of your ears and your head, and we'll make a 3D model of them and synthesize the HRTF. Maybe you'll play an audio game to tune your HRTF. We'll be subtly changing it as you play and home in on the HRTF that gives you the highest score, meaning that it matches you the best. This is a journey we'll all be taking together over the next few years. Ultimately, we're committing to enabling everyone to experience that next level of realism. Hopefully, I've been able to illustrate a bit about our design and decision-making process today and why PlayStation 5 has the feature set that it does. Now comes the fun part. We get to see how the development community takes advantage of that feature set. I'm hoping for the completely unexpected. Will it come from audio, ray tracing, the capabilities of the SSD, or something else? I guess we'll find out soon enough. Thank you for your time today.
What the?特にスペック公開とかなかったね。約1時間か。今回はスペックは多分言ってないね。
で皆さん聞きましたでしょうか。まあほぼ予想通りといえば予想通りでしたね。なるほどなるほど。いやー、予想通りではあったね、確かに。いやでもすごいところもあったよ。ちょっとね、分かった情報をまとめていきたいと思います。まずグラフィック性能10テラフロップスですね。途中から来た方、すいません。まとめますね。途中から来た方のためにもまとめたいと思います。グラフィック性能は 10.3 テラフロップス、9から11って言ってたんでまあピタリ賞は無理でしたけど、まあ予想通りではあるよね。9じゃなくてよかったけど、コメント欄見てるとやっぱり12を超えてほしかったっていう声が結構多いね。いやでもまあよかったよかった。合格点というかね、その偉そうに言えないけど、10.3 テラフロップス、よかったです。10.3、悪くない。9.2 って言われてたからね。夜中に大声出すな、ごめんなさい。声でかいね、ごめんなさい。ちょっと声でかいね。ごめんなさい。BGM うるさすぎたりしない？で、ちょっとごめん、テンションがおかしくなってます。10.3 テラフロップスグラフィックスがで、メモリが16ギガですね。16ギガ、ラムですね。これはロムじゃない。ロム発表されなかったね。ストレージは発表されてません。ラムっていうのは何かって言ったら、これメモリはね、要は風呂敷ってよく呼ばれます。簡単に言うと、こう一度にどれぐらい作業ができるかっていう話。BGM うるさい。分かった。まあはいそうそんな感じなんですよ。で XBOX と同じです。 XBOX も16なので同じです。でね、ちょっと気になったのがSSD の速さ、ロード時間の速さなんだけど、さっきさ、なんて言ったっけ、なんかね 5.5 って言ってた気がするんだよ。ちょっとごめんなさい、あまりにも多すぎて覚えてないけど、5.5 だとしたら XBOX より速いよ。 XBOX SX ね、なんだ確かね、速度なんですけど、これ5.5 っていうのは秒速ってことですね。確か 4.8 だったはず。ちょっとすいません、間違ってたらごめんなさい。多分超えてます。まあこの数字がね勝ってたらそのままロード速度が速いとは限らないんだけど、わかんない。すいません、ちょっと今ね現状聞き取れたところだけ話していくね。まとめた動画はまた出しますけど、現状おそらくロード時間は多分速くなるんだと思う。相当高速なんだと思う。ただそのクイックレジューム機能が対応するかっていうのが、自分でお願いします。ごめんなさい。そういうことか。他の人に言ってるのね。ちょっとうるさすぎたら言ってください。そういう多分そうだよね。多分早いよね。
早いと思うな。
めっちゃ早いですよこれ。めっちゃ早い。自分の持ってるゲーミング PC より早いんじゃないかな。GDDR6 ですもんね。早いよ。ロード時間めっちゃ早い。
PS5 は本当に化け物だな。
相当早くなると思います。だって10倍って言ってたもんね、 PS4 の。 Xbox は Xbox シリーズ X は Xbox One の5倍だったから、まあその単純計算できないと思うけど、かなり早いと思うよ。まあこの誤差ではあるけどね、数字的には。で他に何て言ってましたっけ。3D オーディオの話はまあいいとして、なんか結構最初の方ストリーミングの話してたよね。ごめんなさい、あんまり聞き取れなかった。ストリーミングなんか重要なこと言ってましたっけ。
ストリーミング、
あとは何言ってたっけ。そう PS4 の、上位100タイトルが PS5 ローンチ時に、広報互換性対応です。やっぱり予想通りだね。全タイトルではないけど、まあ重要なところから埋めていくっていうところになるのかな。
100タイトルはやっぱ PS5 でできるね。
レイトレーシングの話はしてたね。レイトレーシングの話はね、自分が聞き取れたのは、レイトレーシングはなんかね、いろいろ言ってたよね。反射、物の反射だとか影だとか、あとは音にも関係するって言って、まあこれはでも一応発表されている情報ではあるけど、レイトレーシングにも相当自信があるっていうことだね。あと 3D 音響か。3D 音響に関してはまあこれも前から言ってたんだけどね、一応2スピーカーで再現はできると。ただしやっぱりヘッドホンが一番いいって今回も言ってたじゃない。ヘッドホン ヘッドフォンがいいまあそんなところかな。耳のなんかの違いよりをさ、熱暴走言ってたね。排熱ってでも言い方ではなかったね。排熱というよりはその熱がなんで発生するかっていうところを PS4 Pro の例を使って熱が発生しにくい構造になってるって言ってたね。
やっぱりスペックは
消費電力も結果的に
発表さ
抑えられると。
れなかったね。
消費電力も抑えられる。
スペックは言われなかったけど、
多分こんなところかな。他に何か言ってました？いやーでもまあ悪くないんじゃない。だってこれからですよ。まだなんか新機能はでも言わなかったね。がっつり開発者向けフッドホンになってるちょっと待ってよ。がっつり開発者向けの話だけだったから、残念ながらその何か一つ新機能を言うって言った自分の予想は外れましたね。それはもう完全に開発者向けの話だけだったね。だけどこれだとさ、いやすごいですよ。十分なんて言うんだろう。例えばこのね、ラムメモリがね12とかだったらちょっと残念だったけど、ここが16っていうところの合格点ですし、SSD も相当高速になりそうだし、これに関しては予想通りだね。100タイトルで 10.3 テラフロップスっていうのが確かに引っかかる人もいるけど、 10.3 とね12の違いってあるっちゃありますけど、例えば自分が使ってる、ゲーミング PC って PS5 のほら覚えてますかね。前自分がゲーミング PC10 テラフロップスのゲーミング PC 使ってこれが PS5 のグラフィックになると思いますよっていう動画出したと思うんですけど、まさにあのグラフィック10テラフロップスは RTX2080 レベルですね。だから今でいうゲーミング PC でいう20万レベルでももちろんパーツによりますよ。バレリアの有名な PC で、組んだらっていうかやったら大体20万ぐらい。グラフィックボードだけだったらもちろんもっと安いですけど、これ AMD ですけどね。 AMD こっちのゲーミング PC の今話してるのは NVIDIA 社のものを使った時の値段の話なんですけど、 AMD 使ってもでもねそんなに15万とかはね切るのは難しいと思うから、だからそれぐらい、少なくとも15万レベルは備わってる。あと1年、あと10月12月ぐらいまでにもっとゲーミング PC も安くなると思うけど、それでも絶対10万は割らないと思うよね。ゲーミング PC と比べるのであれば一概には比べられませんけどね。とりあえず全然悪くはないっていうところですかね。ブースト時って言ってた 10.3 最大ならやばいと思う。いやでも10
PS4 じゃない。
いやーちょっとねまたこれの方が出したいと思いますけど、最近は10.3ブーストで XBOX の方がブースト時の話だとしたら合格点というかめちゃくちゃ悪いわけではないんじゃないのかなと思いますよ。グラフィックなんかね結局開発者の声明というか言ってる意見としてもほとんど差はないって言ってますからね。
起きてる。
だからなんだろうな、8と12だったら分かると思うけど 10と12だった8と12だったら結構わかるかもしれないね。でもまあだって PS4 と PS4 Pro の違いがわからないっていう方もいるじゃないですか。まああれは解像度だからちょっと話が別なのか。まあとりあえずその
寝てるかな。
辺はまた整理していらっしゃいと思います。どうですかね、皆さんのコメントちょっと見ていきますね。すいません、コメント読めなくて。コメント読んで、ちょっと見ていきたいと思います。結局ソフトで買う。まあそうだよね。結局は同じようなソフトが出るでしょうけど、PS5 でしか出ないゲーム。例えば、そのファイナルファンタジーリメイクが今ね、騒がれてるけど、まさにああいう、ビッグタイトルだとか、別に肩を持つわけじゃないけど、自分はどっちも応援してますね、Xbox で。なんで、箱は 2.4 って話。やっぱそうでしょ？速ささ、ロード速度測ってるよね、SSD。測ってるって言い方したらまたなんか、あれになっちゃうけど。多分、ロードの速さは、数値だけ見ると Xbox より速いと思われます。差がありすぎです、認めましょう。まあ、そうだね、正直、8と12なら差はあるよ。
寝たかな。
差はあんまりないなんていうことは言えないよ。だって、いや、8と12は差がありすぎ
ザップしてみるか。
1.5倍でしょ。
よし。
1.5倍は、要は Xbox シリーズ、待って、